Autumn Tides by John Burroughs, from Winter Sunshine. The season is always a little behind the sun in our climate, just as the tide is always a little behind the moon. According to the calendar, the summer ought to culminate about the 21st of June, but in reality it is some weeks later. June is a maiden month all through. It is not high noon in nature till about the first or second week in July. When the chestnut tree blooms, the meridian of the year is reached. By the 1st of August it is fairly 1 o'clock. The luster of the season begins to dim, the foliage of the trees and woods to tarnish, the plumage of the birds to fade, and their songs to cease. The hints of approaching fall are on every hand. How suggestive this thistledown, for instance, which as I sit by the open window comes in and brushes softly across my hand. The first snowflake tells of winter not more plainly than this driving down heralds the approach of fall. Come here, my fairy, and tell me whence you come and whither you go. What brings you to port here, you gossamer ship sailing the great sea? How exquisitely frail and delicate, one of the lightest things in nature, so light that in the closed room here it will lie, it will hardly rest in my open palm. A feather is a clod beside it. Only a spider's web will hold it. Coarser objects have no power over it. Caught in the upper currents of the air and rising above the clouds, it might sail perpetually. Indeed, one fancies it might almost traverse the interstellar ether and drive against the stars. And every thistlehead by the roadside holds hundreds of these sky rovers, imprisoned Ariels unable to set themselves free. Their liberation may be the shock of the wind or the rude contact of cattle, but it is oftener the work of the goldfinch with its complaining brood. The seed of the thistle is the proper food of this bird, and in obtaining it, myriads of these winged creatures are scattered to the breeze. Each one is fraught with a seed which it exists to sow, but its wild careering and soaring does not fairly begin till its burden is dropped and its spheral form is complete. The seeds of many plants and trees are disseminated through the agency of birds, but the thistle furnishes its own birds, flocks of them, with wings more ethereal and tireless than were ever given to mortal creature. From the pains nature thus takes to sow the thistle broadcast over the land, it might be expected to be one of the most troublesome and abundant of weeds, but such is not the case. The more pernicious and baffling weeds, like snapdragon or blind nettles, being more local and restricted in their habits and unable to fly at all. In the fall, the battles of the spring are fought over again, beginning at the other or little end of the series. There is the same advance and retreat with many feints and alarms between the contending forces that was witnessed in April and May. The spring comes like a tide running against a strong wind. It is ever beaten back, but ever gaining ground, with now and then a mad push upon the land as if to overcome its antagonist at one blow. The cold from the north encroaches upon us in about the same fashion. In September or early October it usually makes a big stride forward and blackens all the more delicate plants and hastens the mortal ripening of the foliage of the trees, but it is presently beaten back again and the genial warmth repossesses the land. Before long, however, the cold returns to the charge with augmented forces and gains much ground. The course of the seasons never does run smooth, owing to the unequal distribution of land and water, mountain, wood, and plain. An equilibrium, however, is usually reached in our climate in October, sometimes the most marked in November. Forming the delicious Indian summer, a truce is declared, and both forces, heat and cold, meet and mingle in friendly converse on the field. In the earlier season, this poise of the temperature, this slack water in nature, comes in May and June, but the October calm is most marked. Day after day, and sometimes week after week, you cannot tell which way the current is setting. Indeed, there is no current, but the season seems to drift a little to this way or a little that, just as the breeze happens to freshen a little in one quarter or the other. The fall of '74 was the most remarkable in this respect I remember ever to have seen. The equilibrium of the season lasted from the middle of October till next December with scarcely a break. There were 6 weeks of Indian summer, all gold by day, and when the moon came, all silver by night. The river was so smooth at times as to be almost invisible, and in its place was the indefinite continuation of the opposite shore down toward the nether world. One seemed to be in an enchanted land and to breathe all day the atmosphere of fable and romance. Not a smoke, but a kind of shining nimbus filled all the spaces. The vessels would drift by as if in mid-air with all their sails set. The gypsy blood in one, as Lowell calls it, could hardly stay between four walls and see such days go by. Living in tents in groves and on the hills seemed the only natural life. Late in December we had glimpses of the same weather. The earth had not yet passed all the Golden Isles. On the 27th of that month I find I made this entry in my notebook. A soft, hazy day, the year asleep and dreaming of the Indian summer again, not a breath of air and not a ripple on the river. The sunshine is as hot as it falls across my table. But what a terrible winter followed! What a savage chief the fair Indian maiden gave birth to! This halcyon period of our autumn will always in some way be associated with the Indian. It is red and yellow and dusky like him. The smoke of his campfire seems again in the air. The memory of him pervades the woods. His plumes and moccasins and blankets of skins form just the costume the season demands. It was doubtless his chosen period. The gods smiled upon him, then if ever. The time of the chase, the season of the buck and doe, of the ripening of all forest fruits, the time when all men are incipient hunters, when the first frosts have given pungency to the air, when to be abroad on the hills or in the woods is a delight that both old and young feel. If the red aborigine ever had his summer of fullness and contentment, it must have been at this season, and it fitly bears his name. In how many respects fall imitates or parodies the spring. It is indeed in some of its features a sort of second youth of the year. Things emerge and become conspicuous again. The trees attract all eyes as in May. The birds come forth from their summer privacy and parody their spring reunions and rivalries. Some of them sing a little after a silence of months. The robins, bluebirds, meadowlarks, sparrows, crows, all sport and call and behave in a manner suggestive of spring. The cock grouse drums in the woods as he did in April and May. The pigeons reappear, and the wild geese and ducks. The witch hazel blooms, the trout spawns, the streams again are full. The air is humid, and the moisture rises in the ground. Nature is breaking camp, as in spring she was going into camp. The spring yearning and restlessness is represented in one by the increased desire to travel. Spring is the inspiration, fall the expiration. Both seasons have their equinoxes, both their filmy, hazy air, their ruddy forest tints, their cold rains, their drenching fogs, their mystic moons. Both have the same solar light and warmth, the same rays of the sun, yet after all, how different the feelings which they inspire. One is the morning, the other the evening. One is youth, the other is age. The difference is not merely in us. There is a subtle difference in the air and in the influences that emanate upon us from the dumb forms of nature. All the senses report a difference. The sun seems to have burned out. One recalls the notion of Herodotus, that he has grown feeble and retreats to the south because he can no longer face the cold and the storms from the north. There is a growing potency about his beams in spring, a wandering splendor about them in fall. One is the kindling fire, the other a subduing flame. It is rarely that an artist succeeds in painting unmistakably the difference between sunrise and sunset, and it is equally a trial of his skill to put upon canvas the difference between early spring and late fall, say between April and November. It was long ago observed that the shadows are more opaque in the morning than in the evening, the struggle between the light and the darkness more marked, the gloom more solid, the contrast more sharp, etc. The rays of the morning sun chisel out and cut down the shadows in a way those of the setting sun do not. Then the sunlight is wither and newer in the morning, not so yellow and diffused. A difference akin to this is true of the two seasons I am speaking of. The spring is the morning sunlight, clear and determined. The autumn, the afternoon rays, pensive, lessening, golden. Does not the human frame yield to and sympathize with the seasons? Are there not more births in the spring and more deaths in the fall? In the spring one vegetates. His thoughts turn to sap. Another kind of activity seizes him. He makes new wood which does not harden till past midsummer. For my part, I find all literary work irksome from April to August. My sympathies run in other channels. The grass grows where meditation walked. As fall approaches, the currents mount to the head again, but my thoughts do not ripen well till after there has been a frost. The burrs will not open much before that. A man's thinking, I take it, is a kind of combustion, as is the ripening of the fruits and leaves, and he wants plenty of oxygen in the air. Then the earth seems to have become a positive magnet in the fall. The forge and anvil of the sun have had their effect. In the spring it is negative to all intellectual conditions and drains one of his lightning. Today, October 21st, I found the air in the bushy fields and lanes under the woods loaded with the perfume of the witch hazel, a sweetish, sickening odor. With the blooming of this bush, nature says, positively the last. It is a kind of birth and death of spring and fall that impresses one as a little uncanny. All trees and shrubs form their flower buds in the fall and keep the secret till spring. How comes the witch hazel to be one exception and to celebrate its floral nuptials on the funeral day of its foliage? No doubt it will be found that the spirit of some lovelorn squaw has passed into this bush, and that this is why it blooms in the Indian summer rather than in the white man's spring. But it makes the floral series of the woods complete. Between it and the shad blow of the earliest spring lies the mountain of bloom, the latter at the base on one side, this at the base on the other, with the chestnut blossoms at the top in midsummer. A peculiar feature of our fall may sometimes be seen of a clear afternoon late in the season. Looking athwart the fields under the sinking sun, the ground appears covered with a shining veil of gossamer. A fairy net, invisible at midday, in which the position of the sun now reveals, rests upon the stubble and upon the spears of grass, covering acres in extent, the work of innumerable little spiders. The cattle walk through it, but do not seem to break it. Perhaps a fly would make his mark upon it. At the same time, stretching from the tops of the trees or from the top of a stake in the fence and leading off toward the sky may be seen the cables of the flying spider, a fairy bridge from the visible to the invisible, occasionally seen against a deep mass of shadow and perhaps enlarged by clinging particles of dust. They show quite plainly and sag down like a stretched rope or sway and undulate like a hawser in the tide. They recall a verse of our rugged poet, Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider, I marked wherein a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant vast surrounding, it launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly spreading them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. To return a little, September may be described as the month of tall weeds, where they have been suffered to stand along fences, by roadsides, and in forgotten corners. Red root, pigweed, ragweed, vervain, goldenrod, burdock, elecampane, thistles, teasels, nettles, asters, etc., how they lift themselves up as if not afraid to be seen now. They are all outlaws. Every man's hand is against them. Yet how surely they hold their own. They love the roadside because here they are comparatively safe and ragged and dusty. Like the common tramps that they are, they form one of the characteristic features of early fall. I have often noticed in what haste certain weeds are at times to produce their seeds. Red root will grow 3 or 4 feet high when it has the whole season before it, but let it get a late start, let it come up in August, and it scarcely gets above the ground before it heads out and apparently goes to work with all its might and main to mature its seed. In the growth of most plants or weeds, April and May represent their root, June and July their stalk, and August and September their flower and seed. Hence, when the stalk months are stricken out, as in the present case, there is only time for a shallow root and a foreshortened head. I think most weeds that get a late start show this curtailment of stalk and this solicitude to reproduce themselves, but I have not yet observed any of the cereals are so worldly wise. They have not had to think and shift for themselves as the weeds have. It does indeed look like a kind of forethought in the red root. It is killed by the first frost, and hence knows the danger of delay. How rich in color before the big show of the tree foliage has commenced. Our roadsides are in places in early autumn, rich to the eye that goes hurriedly by and does not look too closely, with the profusion of goldenrod and blue and purple asters dashed in upon here and there with the crimson leaves of the dwarf sumac at the intervals rising out of the fence corner or crowning a ledge of rocks, the dark green of the cedars with the still fire of the woodbine at its heart. I wonder if the waysides of other lands present any analogous spectacles at this season. Then when the maples have burst out into color, showing like great bonfires along the hills, there is indeed a feast for the eye. A maple before your windows in October, when the sun shines upon it, will make up for a good deal of the light it has excluded. It fills the room with a soft, golden glow. Thoreau, I believe, was the first to remark upon the individuality of trees of the same species with respect to their foliage, some maples ripening their leaves early and some late, and some being of one tint and some of another, and moreover, that each tree held to the same characteristics year after year. There is indeed as great a variety among the maples as among the trees of an apple orchard. Some are harvest apples, some are fall apples, and some are winter apples, each with a tint of its own. Those late ripeners are the winter varieties, the Rhode Island greenings or swars of their kind. The red maple is the early astrakhan. Then comes the red streak, the yellow sweet, and others. There are windfalls among them too, as among the apples, and one side or hemisphere of the leaf is usually brighter than the other. The ash has become less noticed for its autumnal foliage than it deserves, the richest shades of plum color to be seen becoming by and by, or in certain lights a deep maroon, are afforded by this tree. Then at a distance there seems to be a sort of bloom on it, as upon the grape or plum. Amid a grove of yellow maple it makes a most pleasing contrast. By mid-October most of the Rip Van Winkles among our brute creatures have lain down for their winter nap. The toads and turtles have buried themselves in the earth. The woodchuck is in his hibernaculum. The skunk in his, the mole in his, and the black bear has his selected and will go in when the snow comes. He does not like the looks of his big tracks in the snow. They publish his goings and comings too plainly. The coon retires about the same time. The provident wood mice and the chipmunk are laying by a winter supply of nuts or grains, the former usually in decayed trees, the latter in the ground. I have observed that any unusual disturbance in the woods near where the chipmunk has his den will cause him to shift his quarters. One October, for many successive days, I saw one carrying into his hole buckwheat which he had stolen from a near field. The hole was only a few rods from where he was getting out stone, and as our work progressed and the racket and uproar increased, the chipmunk became alarmed. He ceased carrying in after much hesitating and darting about, and some prolonged absences he began to carry out. He had determined to move. If the mountain fell, he at least would be away in time. So by mouthfuls or cheekfuls, the grain was transferred to a new place. He did not make a bee to get it done, but carried it all himself, occupying several days and making a trip about every 10 minutes. The red and gray squirrels do not lay by winter stores. Their cheeks are made without pockets, and whatever they transport is carried in their teeth. They are more or less active all winter, but October and November are their festal months. Invade some butternut or hickory nut grove on a frosty October morning and hear the red squirrel beat the juba on a horizontal branch. It is a most lively jig, what the boys call a regular breakdown, interspersed with squeals and snickers and derisive laughter. The most noticeable peculiarity about the vocal part of it is the fact that it is a kind of duet. In other words, by some ventriloquial tricks he appears to accompany himself, as if his voice is split up, a part forming a low guttural sound, a part a shrill nasal sound. The distant bark of the more wary gray squirrel may be heard about the same time. There is a teasing and ironical tone in it, but the gray squirrel is not the puck, the red is. Insects also go into winter quarters by or before this time, the bumblebee, hornet, and wasp. But here only royalty escapes. The queen mother alone foresees the night of winter coming and the morning of spring beyond. The rest of the tribe try gypsying for a while, but perish in the first frosts. The present October I surprised the queen of the yellow jackets in the woods looking out a suitable retreat. The royal dame was house hunting, and on being disturbed by my inquisitive poking among the leaves, she got up and flew away with a slow, deep hum. Her body was unusually distended, whether with fat or eggs I am unable to say. In September I took down the nest of the black hornet and found several large queens in it, but the workers had all gone. The queens were evidently weathering the first frosts and storms here and waiting for the Indian summer to go forth and seek a permanent winter abode. If the covers could be taken off the fields and woods at this season, how many interesting facts of natural history would be revealed. The crickets, ants, bees, reptiles, animals, and for aught I know, the spiders and flies, asleep or getting ready to sleep in their winter dormitories, the fires of life banked up and burning just enough to keep the spark over till spring. The fish all run down the stream in the fall except the trout. It runs up or stays up and spawns in November, the male becoming as brilliantly tinted as the deepest dyed maple leaf. I have often wondered why the trout spawns in the fall instead of in the spring like other fish. It is not because a full supply of clear spring water can be counted on at that season more than at any other. The brooks are not so liable to be suddenly muddied by heavy showers and defiled with the washings of the roads and fields as they are in the spring and summer. The artificial breeder finds that absolute purity of water is necessary to hatch their spawn, also that a shade and a low temperature are indispensable. Our northern November day itself is like spring water. It is melted frost, dissolved snow. There is a chill in it, and an exhilaration also. The forenoon is all morning, and the afternoon all evening. The shadows seem to come forth and to revenge themselves upon the day. The sunlight is diluted with darkness. The colors fade from the landscape, and only the sheen of the river lights up the gray and brown distance.